Well, Michael Gove is the Communities Secretary, and usually when it comes to terrorism, when it comes to extremism, that's to do with the Home Office, and he has never been Home Secretary, but he's always had very, very strong views on extremism in this country, on Islamism, the very violent and destructive terrorism supporting part, subsect of Islam. Of course, there are many, many peaceful, totally peaceful Muslims in this country who want to have the same way of life as everybody else, of every other religion, but there are Islamists. There are people, including some people on those marches, including in London yesterday, who support Islamism, who support violent jihad, Hamas terrorists, those who did what they did on the 7th of October, the horrendous attacks, the maiming, the using rape as a weapon. That's something we've talked about on this show last week. There are people who support them. They're on our streets. They're on the streets of London. They're across the UK as well. They're often holding up signs and making chants like "From the River to the Sea," which I see as anti-Semitic, and many other people do as well, because it calls for the destruction of Israel. We also have people being openly anti-Semitic, supporting jihad, supporting Hamas terrorists on these marches. But not everybody on these marches is, of course, doing that. There are probably many well-intentioned people who just want, as they would see it, peace in the Middle East. There's freedom of assembly in this country, there's freedom of religion, there's freedom of speech. And there will be lots of people who think that they are doing the right thing by doing that. I don't think they are, and I think that if you go on a march which has anybody in it, and this has all been very, very clear, all very, very public, that there are anti-Semitic people on those marches. But Michael Gove is now saying, don't march alongside extremists. He's told pro-Palestine protesters that they risk rubbing shoulders with extremists and pledged to expose groups trying to, as he puts it, subvert democracy. He's done an interview with the Sunday Telegraph. He said that some pro-Palestinian events have been organised by extremist organisations. Well, his cabinet colleague, the Health Secretary, Vicky Atkins, she's the relatively new Health Secretary, she spoke to Sky News this morning, and this on extremism is what she said.
People, other citizens in our country feel deeply uncomfortable, and so it is that balancing act between, as you say, the freedom of speech, but also the right of citizens to go about their daily lives.
Rachel Reeves as well, the Labour's Shadow Chancellor, probably going to be the first woman Chancellor of this country. She talked a lot about economics to Sky News this morning, but she also talked about extremism, and that's what we're talking about now. And this is what Rachel Reeves had to say to Sky News a little bit earlier.
Well, we haven't seen the list yet, or the new definition of extremism that Michael Gove is talking about in the newspapers today. So we'll wait to see what he produces. But I do think it is right that we look again at the definition. But the most important thing from my perspective is that more is done to bring communities together. The vast majority of people in this country respect, tolerate difference, welcome difference and diversity. It's one of the things that make our country great. But of course, it is always right to tackle extremism and hatred wherever it rears its head.
Okay, so what do you think of what Rachel Reeves said there? What do you think of what Vicky Atkins said? What do you think of what Michael Gove is saying about this? Mick in Wallington has been in touch, says every police officer in the country should be ashamed of themselves. Michael Gove should advise them not to march and protect extremists. So are the police doing the job they should do? These protests are just continuing. They've gone on and on and on. Some people say they've made their point. Wayne's been in touch. I blame all the universities for the growth of these activists on these protests. What are these tutors teaching? Well, actually, there's a lot that we're going to continue to talk about the Chinese aspect in this as well, because there are academics who've been told not to teach certain things because of the Chinese money that's coming into our universities. It might upset the Communist Party there. There are lots and lots of different aspects of this story, but let's focus on the extremism, the Islamism issue, which we often do on this programme. Let's talk to Gary Mond. He's the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. Gary, thank you for joining us this morning. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Let me get your reaction, first of all, to what Michael Gove is telling protesters. It's sort of been my line for quite a long time, actually. He's pledging to expose groups that seek to subvert democracy. But surely if you're marching alongside those protesters, some of whom, not all, but some of whom are chanting horrendous, vile, illegal, anti-Semitic things, you're giving them some legitimacy.
Michael Gove's diagnosis of the problem is spot on. We have got a situation where these marches have been infiltrated by anti-Semitic extremists. They're not pro-Palestinians, they're simply anti-Semitic. If they were pro-Palestinians, they would have been demonstrating when tens of thousands of Palestinians were murdered by Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. But what I particularly liked about what Michael Gove had to say was he differentiated strongly between anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia.
What's the difference?
Hatred,
because Gary, we hear this a lot, and there are lots of people saying that there should be a universal definition of Islamophobia. What, in your mind, is the definition between Islamophobia, which I think is a very loaded term, and straightforwardly anti-Muslim hatred?
There's a huge difference. Anti-Muslim hatred, like anti-Semitism, is aimed at people, and that is absolutely vile. Islamophobia, although it's something of a made-up word, I fear, but Islamophobia is a concern about aspects of the religion of Islam. And one of the worst aspects of all of this is that you don't have similar kinds of expressions with other religions. For example, those of us who do not believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah are not called Christian folks. Those who have concerns about aspects of the Jewish Torah concerning homosexuals are not called Judaphobes. If you've got a concern about an aspect of a religion, that is completely legitimate, and it is a breach of freedom of speech to stop people from speaking out about it.
Would you, by that logic, Gary, and this is quite a provocative question, but would you, by that logic, be happy to be called Islamophobic?
The question is how. I don't accept the word, so yeah. I don't accept being called that word or not being called that word. I think the word is made up. It's not defined, and it should never be defined. We should focus much more strongly on anti-Muslim hatred, which is a completely legitimate term and is every bit as bad as anti-Semitism.
So when you hear this, I mean, tell me your thoughts on this, actually, as the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, because we hear a lot about London being a no-go area for Jewish people, especially on these days that pro-Palestinian protests come out. There is evidence that some Jewish people actually do go on these protests. I don't really understand why, but they do, and they're entitled to their views. But actually, and also today, you know, Humza Yousaf giving £250,000 to Gaza after overruling his officials. Give me your reaction to these stories, Gary.
Well, deal with Yousaf first. I believe his in-laws had been in Gaza and needed to get out. And one needs to have an investigation into exactly what happened, because I think that Yousaf has a tremendous conflict of interest. But that's for people to investigate.
I find it really weird, Gary, that, I mean, he was told his officials recommended between £100,000 and £200,000. So listen, this is a lot of money, but it's not a lot in terms of the whole budget of Scotland. But the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, stepped in after officials recommended giving between £100,000 and £200,000 donation to UNICEF. Now, that is the United Nations agency which provides humanitarian aid to children. That was to fund water programmes in Gaza. But he overruled their advice, declaring that £250,000, more than they recommended, of taxpayers' money in Scotland should instead be given to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. And it has been criticised, and I mean, there's a lot of evidence, over alleged links to Hamas. The fact that Hamas's sort of technical infrastructure was actually underneath their headquarters in Gaza as well. We've reported on this before on this programme. I mean,
we already know for certain that large numbers of UNRWA staff have been working with Hamas. Some of them are even believed to hold some of the Israeli hostages at the moment. The idea that money should be given by anybody to UNRWA is completely reprehensible. And the entire situation concerning Yousaf and this donation needs to be fully investigated.
Yeah. Gary, can you give me your thoughts as well on a text from Kevin Sadler? We've been reading this story yesterday about a man who held a sign yesterday saying that Hamas are terrorists. I would be happy to hold that sign. I've said it many, many times on this programme because it's true. And he
yes,
was
indeed.
And tell us what happened to him.
Well, my understanding is the police are claiming he was arrested for his own safety, which I find bizarre.
Arrested for his own safety. This is, sorry, can I just check we're in 2024 here? So this is Kevin Sadler's been in touch. Hi, Peter, I'm Kevin from London. I'm disgusted with the way the man was arrested by about 6 police officers yesterday for having a sign reading that Hamas are terrorists. They are terrorists. Police need to have a hard look at themselves for their heavy-handedness with that young man. Love the show, and Kevin says other nice things I won't repeat. But the fact is that He was arrested for his own safety. What a bizarre...
That is what the press have said, the police have said. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what I've read in the newspapers.
Yeah.
But what is particularly bad is you can compare this with a situation where our Prime Minister and our Leader of the Opposition are accused of facilitating genocide, and there are posters saying that, and no action is taken there. And of course, no action has been taken at all on all these horrendous calls for from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which are blatant anti-Semitism and Jew hatred.
I should say that if you're watching on talkTV, although about 9 out of 10 of people who watch or listen to the show are actually listening on radio, just for them, to say that we're showing footage now of a man holding up a sign saying Hamas are terrorists. The sign was torn down and police arrested him, apparently for his own safety. This is absolutely mad. Gary, what is, I mean, you've talked about your support for what Michael Gove has said in regard to terrorism and in regard to what extremists are and this definition and so on. Do you think anything's going to actually change?
I hope so, and I pray so. And I also hope that the government and the opposition will work together on this, because this is something that affects us all. It isn't a conservative concept. It's for everyone. Every freedom-loving person in this country must do their best to pray for what Michael Gove is trying to do, and hopefully others will work with him, to achieve the ultimate eradication of the extremism that we're seeing on our streets today and the massive amounts of anti-Semitism that are generated. I think it's more than 5,000 incidents of anti-Semitism since the war began on the 7th of October. And we've seen it in schools, in hospitals, in businesses, on the streets, in shop windows being smashed, physical assaults against Jews. And this has all emanated from the hatred, in my opinion, that is being caused by these marches.
Gary, tell me, I asked this question of quite a number of my guests. I'm not Jewish, but I have a lot of sympathy with what is going on. I think anti-Semitism is horrendous. You've given us the figures there. It has risen. We've seen that from the Community Security Trust. We've seen that from a number of organisations who keep a record of all of these attacks. And they are attacks. They are horrendous things that are happening often to children going to school. You need security guards at their school gate. It is awful. What can I, and lots of people watching and listening, as non-Jews, do to help our Jewish brothers and sisters in this really tricky time for them?
Make your voices known to your members of parliament, campaign where you can against extremism, and shout as loud as you can, and do what you're doing at the moment on your show, Peter, frankly, and hopefully other presenters will do the same. Highlight as much as possible the hatred that's going on. I actually am slightly optimistic because there is one tiny point about the marches that is beneficial. It is turning people who've got no particular views on the subject, no view on Israel, no view on Jews, no view on the Middle East at all. They're finding that their lives are being affected by these marches. Yep. Their Christmas shopping was ruined by these marches. They're witnessing the hatred. As every week goes by, they're witnessing the hatred more and more. And there are more and more people coming round to our side. And the one thing that I particularly am interested in is the attitude of the Christian community. We've seen a lot of support given to Jews by non-Jews, particularly Christians, who have been organising demonstrations around the country. I was speaking up last week in Glasgow. We had about 600 to 700 people at a rally against anti-Semitism. And it was very heartening to see a rally with very, very few Jewish people there. So supportive of the Jewish community and indeed for Israel.